Hey, I started this video in early December, so this has nothing to do with Rooster Teeth's closure. It is very unfortunate, and I hope everyone who gets displaced finds a job that they can be just as passionate about. Hey, you know what would be sick? A show where you have anime-fied fairy tales like Red Riding Hood, fighting evil monsters made out of shadows with weapons that are part gun and have superpowers, and did I mention that the guns are actually used for their recoil to make a swing hit harder? All with one of the most invigorating soundtracks that has ever been made? Well, this is exactly what the RWBY fanbase was sold on nearly 10 years ago by Monty Ohm's RWBY. A web series so unique that it is probably one of the only shows that truly deserve the title of being an American anime. A uniqueness that worked in the series' favor as popularity skyrocketed volume after volume, going from a web series so small that it didn't even have a budget left over for background characters to being the first American anime-esque series to get an official Japanese dub. However, while at the time of writing, RWBY has made it to Volume 9, there is a sizable chunk of the fanbase that consider Volume 3 not only the peak of the series, but the truly last good volume, and the reasoning for this is simple. Starting with Volume 4, RWBY faced a complete change to its identity as focus, presentation, and production all shifted. Pair this with the all-too-soon passing of the creator Monty Ohm shortly into the production of the third volume, it was easy to draw a clear line between what from RWBY was good and what was bad, and as someone who started RWBY in Volume 2 and chose to drop it by the time Volume 7 came around, this is the mindset that I had. RWBY was a show that I used to like, but not anymore. It just lost its identity and only changed for the worse. However, that's not an opinion that I've properly evaluated in a while, so I did what any sane person would do, and I binged the entire series including games, manga, and anything else I could get my hands on to figure out two things. Did RWBY truly lose its identity rather than simply change with the times? And would I still consider myself a RWBY fan regardless of the first answer? And that was a much harder question to answer than I originally thought. In order to illustrate my thought process throughout the series, I'm going to break down each of the three main arcs' positive and negative qualities to see how enjoyable they are to watch, and also try to figure out what the general goal for each arc was. And I am also going to ask you to subscribe. Hey, wouldn't it be cool?
Once upon a time, there was a girl gifted with a magical, vibrant red hood. She loved this hood and would wear it all across her village with pride. While only a few would complain of its obnoxious and bright colour, many more appreciated the beauty and warmth it would bring, and the more she continued to be herself, wearing the hood she loved with pride, the more vibrant it would become.
In the Red trailer that came out in 2013, we see an anime girl with a clear Red Riding Hood motif get surrounded by fitting wolf-like creatures. What happens in the next 3 minutes and 28 seconds can only be described as some of the sickest action choreography, as this anime girl, now using a combination of a sniper rifle and a scythe, eviscerate every single monster in a way that you can't tell if she's showing off or if the animator is, with clever and stylish takedowns. Including, but not limited to, wrapping the blade around one of the monsters and using the recoil from the rifle to cut it in half. Besides being a video of 17 million views, this was the very first look the world would get to a phenomenon created by Monty Ohm. A phenomenon called RWBY. That said, just calling Monty the creator feels like an understatement. It was more like he was RWBY with his boundless, unique brand of creativity. From the premise of fairy tale inspired characters enrolling in a combat school to become huntsmen and huntresses whose job it is to fight those shadow creatures we saw earlier called Grimm, to the unique aesthetic that fuses flat, impossibly vibrant colors with a vibe only comparable to niche JRPGs on the PS2. Which is most definitely fitting, as one of Monty Ohm's original projects before joining Rooster Teeth was Dead Fantasy, an animated series where Final Fantasy and Dead or Alive characters beat the living hell out of each other. He also made Haloid. This isn't relevant, but Haloid does end with a reveal that Master Chief is a girl. That's honestly the only reason I wanted to bring Haloid up. The creativity sown into RWBY's DNA doesn't end there. Whether it be how every character's name involves a cover with rules written out in case you wanted to make a RWBY OC of your own, which people did, to how characters are put into teams where their initials spell out or mean another color, which is where the namesake of RWBY comes from, that being the team of Ruby, Weiss, Blake, and Ying, our four main characters. There are also characters with animal traits like ears, horns, or a tail, called faunus. But if you know RWBY, then you know the part that illustrates the very essence of its batshit insane nature the best. The one that these aspects pale in comparison to, and that's the weapons. A detail that can only be truly introduced with, hey, you wanna see something cool? Weapons in RWBY are one of its most iconic qualities, and that's just for the insane variety that can come from the simple formula of magic or gun plus melee weapon. A short list of how expansive these weapons can be includes glow stick nunchucks that are cracked to activate magical effects, gun nunchucks, affectionately nicknamed gunchucks, the previously stated gun scythe crescent rows, but hell, scrapped and needing to be a weapon part, like Reese, who has a hoverboard that's main way of attacking is kick-flipping and transforming into dual revolvers, but hell, scrapped needing a weapon at all, like Mercury Black, who just put guns in his shoes that fire bullets when he kicks, justifying a fighting style made up of breakdancing. While these weapons are in fact rad as hell, they exist to complement RWBY's strongest asset, that being While weapons are the most iconic, this era of RWBY is definitely defined by its fight scenes, and for good reason. Each fight has so many layers that keep up this fast-paced, almost rhythmic way to show combat. Choreography is done with a pose-to-pose styling where characters go from one pose to another with a quick and snappy strike or chains of strikes in between, most of which punctuated with a gunshot to add to the fast-paced carnage. The effect of these traits together give a feeling reminiscent to watching high-end fighting game gameplay. And to further the game comparison, each character has what's called an aura, which is a limited skin level force field that absorbs the damage that would normally kill people, which works as a perfect justification for how characters can casually walk off being punched by a giant robot or anything else that makes a really cool fight scene. Most characters also have a semblance, which is a unique superpower that adds an entire new personalized layer to each fighting style, and these powers can vary drastically. Whether it be a speed burst that leaves behind rose petals, polarity, clones that can take a hit, self that can take hits. It adds such a high level of variety, and all of these aspects together lets fights get absolutely bonkers, as it can range against creatures of Grimm who early on seem to specialize on being delightfully boneless that makes chopping them up super satisfying. Military robots from the Kingdom of Atlas, the system of kingdoms I will elaborate on later, that's entire thing is being a military-based kingdom, or characters actually fight other characters in a clash of their own unique weapons, semblances, and fighting styles. Characters can also work together or against each other. Hell, the third volume is a tournament arc where different groups across the world of Remnant are fighting. And one of the production facts that makes these fights so much more interesting is just how little actual planning went into them. Many action sequences and storyboard being left blank with just a Monty action to fill in that part later. There was a lot of trust that details could be left out of planning, so much that it had a production term called Monty Ohm's Rule of Cool. And a lot of choices were made with this term in mind. Most aspects had its brush with this method, whether it be world building like the map of Remnant being made by pouring ketchup on a napkin and just folding it over, or just how much the plot was affected by these spur-of-the-moment ideas. Like adding the existence of magical maidens based off seasons after Volume 2 finished, completely recontextualizing the world just casually. It made the show unpredictable in a very exciting way. Crucial plot details could show up and the world seemed spontaneous and vast enough that it would sell the stuff happening really well. The existence of the antagonist Neo may be the most prominent example of this. Probably one of the most recognizable characters from the Beacon era, most of her comes from last-minute decisions. For the full context of her appearance, our main team was fighting against notorious in-universe criminal and beautiful eyelash haver Roman Torchwick. He needed to have an escape, and it would be an awful amount of work to justify a helicopter or something. But wouldn't it be really cool if he just broke in the glass? Well, that at least needs to be explained, so why not just take a character that ended up being scrap, give her a semblance that would let that happen, and oh wow, one of the most iconic RWBY characters has been created. There is such a fun energy to this era of RWBY, where anything could happen, like a food fight that could only be accurately described as an all-out war, or hell, maybe characters get into a synchronized dance with no explanation. Narrative analysis be damned, this arc of RWBY is just so much fun. However, Narrative analysis cannot be damned for long when you are talking about the long-term enjoyability of a story. While action scenes being spontaneous, created by a team of people that have mastered— wait guys, I have a cool idea. The habit of not planning far ahead has had negative consequences on the story, leading to plotlines that should have had more weight either feeling like they are dropped or somehow repeated. Like for the first example, the leader of Team Juniper, Jean-Arc, reveals in the first volume that he actually snuck into the Beacon School. A security flaw like that could connect heavily to how villains later infiltrate the school, and in a way, it would somehow connect to Jean for what happened through that. Instead, him sneaking in was used for a 2-episode bullying plotline and one comment in Volume 8. For the other issue, Weiss Schnee goes through the same character arc 3 separate times, where she's arrogant, rude, or closed-minded due to her upper society upbringing. This problem of introducing something and not being certain extends to character writing as well. RWBY ranges from defining personality traits going from socially awkward and obsessive over weapons to generally being naive. It honestly makes the characterization of her in spin-offs really weird, as they rarely seem like the same character. And you know what? If all of these seem like small nitpicks, well, that's because they are. But it's important to note that these flaws do add up, and unnecessary plotlines take up space that could help RWBY's biggest problem, which is a continuous habit of telling rather than showing. It is fully understandable that a decent bit of world building and plot progression can occur through dialogue. That's perfectly okay, and nearly every story is gonna have that to some extent. However, RWBY's biggest problem comes from how many fundamental aspects of the world are only revealed through dialogue or the sideshow world of Remnant. For example, Faunus are oppressed, which is a huge plot point for Blake, the member of Team RWBY who's a Faunus. This is a pivotal aspect of the world, as it's a story that follows through to the next arc as well. There's an organization called the White Fang that turned radically violent because of this fact. It is not a small deal, however, besides one bullying scene, we don't see anything related to Faunus oppression other than Blake talking about it. And while that does have negative effects going forward, the worst example of being told rather than shown may be one of the most important plot points. Allow me to explain, and this is where the video starts getting into spoiler territory. The world of Remnant, where RWBY takes place, is made up of 4 primary different kingdoms: Vacuole, Mistral, Atlas, and Vale. They are fairly unified thanks to communication towers that service this world's internet. However, the issue with the system is that if one tower goes down, they all go down and lose connection to each other, so kingdoms would no longer be able to communicate. The villains plan on taking down one of the towers in order to separate the world. Good plan? Yes! However, we do not learn how the communication towers work until a World of Remnant 5 episodes before the communication towers fell. This information could have been in any of the classroom scenes, or when RWBY and Weiss outright went to the tower in order to use it. So the communications tower falling had all the subtlety of Sharkov's gun if the gun was in a murderer's hand saying, "I am going to murder you with this." It's not story ruining, and to be fully fair, using the narrative as a list of negatives is a disservice to RWBY and what its writing really excels at. Remnant is well crafted for a lot of the plot lines that RWBY has. Grimm are attracted to fear and panic, so bigger revelations like the existence of magic, maidens, or greater threats in the series make sense to be kept secret. It makes what would normally be a contrivance work well for this world, and it makes the entire series have this unintended theme of secrecy that gets well built upon later, and justifies how stuff can just get randomly added in the middle of seasons. General scene-to-scene writing is also really good thanks to how every character, even if inconsistent, is written to be so likable. Whether that be the main cast like Ruby Rose, who has an earnest desire to become a huntress because she admired the heroes in fairy tales, Pira Nikos from Team Juniper, who's a superstar huntress in training that just wanted to be treated like a normal person, which led to a really cute dynamic with Jean, who had no idea who she was. And there are also side characters like Penny, who's a fairly socially unaware eccentric girl, who's also apparently a robot. And these are just a few examples of a huge pool of characters that continuously grow, that all have their own quirks, character arcs, and dynamics as they roam around a pseudo-slice of life story. Thanks to Rooster Teeth's 11 years of producing stuff like Red vs. Blue prior to RWBY coming out, the show has such a strong identity that finds its way into every character while also throwing in a little something special to Rooster Teeth fans.
I think he was some sort of cat, actually.
What, like a puma?
Say that again.
I think it looks more like a puma.
What in Sam hell is a puma?
But this experience in production has given each character such a strong identity, so much so that it's hard to not have a favorite, as everyone either has a fun or cool attitude or a badass weapon. There's just such an enjoyable, lighthearted charm to it all, but one that knows how to get a lot less lighthearted when the time calls for it. A feeling absolutely nailed when any of the OST written by Jeff and Casey Williams comes on, which is incredible, some of the best music in any series ever, and that statement will not need to be updated as volumes progress, and it's not an opinion, it's literally a fact. All of these aspects paint vividly the picture of this intense but fun, hey it's young people that are saving the day vibe which radiates through the first 2 volumes. And this is contrasted with the best aspect of RWBY's writing, which are the villains. If the main cast are the heroes in this fairy tale, then the villains aren't the monsters that lurk in the shadows, but instead are the fire that burns the page that the very story itself is written on, taking away everything that we know about this world. In the early parts of RWBY, the good guys always win, as they are able to interrupt a Lightfang Dust robbery, stop the breach of Grimmentown, and just consistently be in the right place at the right time to thwart the evil plans of Roman Torchwick. And if he was the only problem in Remnant, well this would be a very different series. Unfortunately though, there is Cinder, who's been orchestrating the very fall of Beacon, and all Team RWBY has accomplished has hardly been an inconvenience. As the series progresses, the number of moments that our main cast are completely unaware of begin to pile up. Times where they interact unknowingly with the very people who are handcrafting the calamity that will fall upon Beacon. At no point are you certain or confident that the villains are going to keep getting away with it, but they just keep gathering information, they keep infiltrating, and they keep gaining the trust of our heroes. And then by the end of Volume 3, the heroes are dealt a massive blow that coming back from is just not in the cards. On a stage meant to bring the world closer together and feel safer because of it, the unimaginable happens as lives are lost or completely changed. The villains win, the Grim push harder than ever before, and Beacon by an unseen hand with the intent to do the same to every other kingdom, falls, alongside the world's ability to communicate. If the only question for RWBY was if the identity changed, the answers are very plain and very intentional yes. But at least at this point, that's not a bad thing, as it feels like RWBY has been building to this entire climactic moment of Beacon falling. And despite its flaws, it is a well done scene, especially at the kickoff where it's just high stakes fight after high stakes fight, as the mission goes from saving Beacon to just trying to figure out what the hell is happening. But right here, the identity of RWBY did change, and it wasn't for the worse, judging by how strong the commitment was to make sure there wasn't a status quo to return to. Beacon is gone. Like, gone. Team RWBY has been split up as RWBY travels with the remnants of Team Juniper for answers. Weiss gets shipped back home to Atlas, Blake runs away from everything, and Yang is recovering from losing her arm. RWBY is different now, both the show and the team, and it's up to the next arc to make sure that that was a good choice rather than a mistake. This is originally where I wanted to move on to the Haven arc of RWBY, but I can't move on without discussing the impact that early RWBY's identity had on the fans. There are a lot of examples of choices made specifically for fan creations, whether that be character designs having noticeable pockets or containers for cosplayers, or the color naming rule being public so people with OCs would know what bounds to stay in when naming their character. This consideration for fans, paired with the incredible unique aspects of RWBY, was an invitation to be able to have a place of their own within this world, and was a call to anyone creative, which was certainly a call that got answered. Each of RWBY's most defining characteristics has dedicated members of the fandom, abbreviated cutely as FNDM, that specialize in creating those aspects, ranging from people making their own OCs and 3D modelers who make custom gun hybrid weapons, all the way to people who make whole-ass fan animations that recreate the style from this era of RWBY. One of my favorites being Red Like Roses by AK Motions that turned the Red trailer into an 8-minute music video with insanely dynamic set pieces that I always stop and watch whenever it comes up. But there is also a scrap fight between Team Juniper and the character Raven Bronwyn that was supposed to happen in Volume 3 that Lebowski Arts animated what that could have looked like. Now imagine all three of those types of creations put together. Now you have full RWBY trailer inspired fan animations of completely original characters that fit perfectly into this world, like the Silver animations by Arc Assembly. Not enough actual independent show for you? How about Evermorrow, which is an alternate universe where Volume 3 didn't end so sadly, and the series continued with Beacon. At the time of writing, there's also Dustqueen, which released a trailer that looks so good I had friends ask me if it was an official spin-off. RWBY had always been a show that stretched out its hand and said, if you want to make something, just give it a shot. Part of that could be its independent feel, its rough edges that didn't go away no matter how much it visually evolved throughout the Beacon arc. The reason why it's so important to talk about RWBY's fanbase when going over this era's identity is because it shows how much RWBY managed to not only leave room to include people in whatever capacity they wanted to participate in, but it also inspired people by showing them media in a way they've never seen it before, and any change to this approach could have a monumental effect on RWBY's perception.
As time passed, the girl outgrew the hood. Still as radiant and vibrant as ever, it could no longer fit atop her head, so a substitute would have to be found. After all, it is why the villagers loved her. Maybe a larger cloak, or even a scarf. As she changed, she noticed the adoration of the people around her fade from their eyes. Some even wishing aloud that she continued to wear the all-too-small hood, upset that the girl was no longer someone they knew with her unfamiliar scarf. The words wounded her, and she found herself thinking, why would I even bother trying to wear this? It doesn't fit and it doesn't work anymore. As this crossed her mind, the cloak began to lose the vivid colour that she once loved so.
RWBY went downhill after Volume 3 is a common sentiment from casual to hardcore fans, and it's understandable why people would feel that way. There was a shift at the foundational level that saw RWBY go from a show that wants cool stuff to happen with clear inspiration from its personality-driven company, that looks unlike any other web series, rigid JRPG, aesthetical charm and all, to being a lot more traditionally animated that sanded off a lot of the personality-fueled edges. Visually, the show looks a lot sharper after they moved away from Smith Poser to Autodesk Maya, but that RWBY branded personality was partially lost, and there's a new prioritization of the narrative that had varied results. The best way to illustrate how different the priorities of RWBY are now is that the first segment regarding this era is about the narrative and not the combat. That's because the narrative is where it feels like the experimental nature really got transferred to as storytelling risks started to be taken. To catch up with the plot, the main team of RWBY are split up and will have to take their own separate arcs in order to reunite. There's the new character Oscar, who has the old headmaster Beacon in his head and their souls are gonna merge.
All I see is wasted energy.
Cinder, who seemed like the main baddie, is actually just an underling to the new villain Salem, who looks like a terrifying fusion of a Grimm and a person. And there's the general pursuit of the magical seasonal maidens and also magical relics that have different powers that might also be able to fight Salem. If that sounds like a lot, well, it certainly is! Stowaway complaint aside, the setup for the Haven arc is very functional for wanting to explore around with different storytelling possibilities of RWBY, as across 4 different perspectives, it's shown a lot of the world. From the emotionally cold, ignorant heights of Atlas society, the remote villages in between kingdoms, the fortress of evil and naughtiness, the isolated island that the fauna treat as their own little sanctuary away from the rest of the world. It's so interesting how grand this setting is once we broke away from the holographic cityscape of Beacon and Vale. It's also a fairly nice, unexpected angle to take 4 characters whose entire bit is being a united team and then separate them for multiple volumes, as Team RWBY did not reunite until the very end of Volume 5. Personal highlights for this experimental phase for RWBY are the episode centered around Salem's backstory and the Apathy Grimm. The prior being an episode that shows what the world was like way before the show began, and how deep this plot runs, as the main villain is an immortal thing that pissed off a couple of gods, that is also capable of using old world magic, and these episodes perfectly outlined her character and desires. Keeping what one of RWBY's core inspirations are in mind, having a mostly isolated, standalone short story with kind of a moral at the end is, like, if you think about it, kind of like a, it's kind of like, it's actually really similar to a fairy tale. But if Salem's episode is a fairy tale, then the Apathy Grimm is more like a haunting cryptid, as it turns the essence of RWBY into a horror, as its entire purpose is being an unseen entity that kills people by draining away their very motivation and will to live. And this is taught as it happens to our main cast in front of our very eyes. That said, not every experiment was successful. The choice to split up Team RWBY was interesting as it gave each member different goals and arcs that would ultimately lead them to Haven, but these arcs were not created equally, and they also each ended at different points in volumes 4 and 5. So there were large portions of time where these characters just sort of waited for everyone else to catch up with the plot. And the stories that cause us to wait aren't nearly effective enough to justify this. Blake's arc involves her wanting to go back to her home to reconnect with her parents, but it unwinds into the fauna suppression plotline, which was received really poorly, because at no point in any of the volumes do you ever see any faunus actually being directly oppressed. That would explain why the radical violent faunus group, the White Fang, exists. And after volume 5, it's essentially scrapped, despite the fact that it was core to the series from the very beginning. It's still a part of the world, but it's not nearly as much of a driving force anymore. That said, the worst part of RWBY's narrative is the consistent reliance on exposition that is still so very prevalent, and due to the adventure-based direction change, it's a lot worse than it was in the Beacon arc. The earlier volumes followed one core plotline in a hub-based setting, and while there was a fairly large cast, characters were able to go in and out of relevancy as they were able to be up to their own thing whenever they wanted without tabs having to be kept on them. Now, we no longer have that hub, and we follow at points 10 different characters who are going through 4 different plot points, and to make sure every plot moves along, character interactions are now reduced to reasons to give exposition and to receive exposition. To use the fauna suppression plotline again, Sung Wukong, who is a monkey faunus who comes from a different kingdom, is outright written to not know about any of the faunus-based prejudice that defines Blake's character. Like the history of the island of Menagerie, it is a safe haven for the faunus, but it's also where humans wanted the faunus to be confined to after they received it as a reward for helping them fight in a war. It's also a slap in the face to faunus, as 2/3 of it is actually uninhabitable desert filled with dangerous wildlife, making even the optional population cramped together. This is actually what led to the faunus rights revolution that we've been hearing about since volume 1, and Sun knew none of this just so Blake had someone to tell it to so the viewer would also know, because there is no information given diegetically about this place being anything other than a tropical paradise. It would have made a lot more sense for Sun to know all of this history from his own people, and his storytelling would have been a lot more effective if any of this was shown rather than outright told. However, it is what it is, and what it is Sun not knowing what prejudice is. And while RWBY does try to have its subtle moments, there are some weird choices. Like in volume 6, when everyone's in Pyrrha's hometown, Jean is cracking under the pressure of every plot moment so far, and to subtly remind us of Pyrrha and the encouragement she gave, Jean finds an outright whole-ass statue of her in the center of town, and someone who's probably a family member that also talks about Pyrrha. It's a lot easier to say how you would fix a scene when you aren't trying to create a scene from scratch. But these are just a few examples of how RWBY feels the need to explain everything to make sure you're on the same page that they want you to be on. It isn't the worst crime in the world, but when you are transitioning from a series known for the scene where an anime girl decapitates a bird of evilness and darkness while intense rock music plays into something more narratively focused, it better be a damn good narrative. That said, the story isn't just something to complain about. There are moments that manage to land without being spelled out to you, and it's these moments that are so effective in character building and are also really heartwarming. However, the narrative is at its strongest when dealing with a smaller cast with less going on. When 4 different narratives aren't trying to all fit into the same 12-episode box, RWBY is able to let interactions be memorable and natural, as it's not trying to give information about whatever is relevant to that character. And the start of Volume 6 thrived for this reason. In the first episode, half the cast got separated after Grimm attacked a train they were all on, and with their journey on foot to make it to the port city of Argus being the only focus for multiple episodes, RWBY was able to build whatever atmosphere it needed, like for the Salem episode or the Apathy Grimm episodes. While some problems return after the separated section is over, there is still a lot to like about this entire arc of RWBY. The theme of secrecy that was danced around in the earlier volumes really starts to shine, as it turns out that Ozpin has been keeping a lot from the main cast. It's really good tension that would have been washed away if we had to share the runtime of a party and a half of people. And regardless of the negatives, I do appreciate wanting to experiment and attempting ideas that aren't proven to work, even if they ended up not doing well. What I don't want to excuse as much though are the changes that were made to RWBY's combat. There are many ways to open this section, but few hold the raw power of this comment that said, the pacing of those fight scenes is like watching porn with bad internet. One core aspect that fueled the quality of RWBY's early fights is the care that went into keeping things exciting and fast-paced. This ranges from how cool and dynamic the set pieces were able to be, combined with weapons that could only exist in a world where a recoil from a gun is more valuable than the bullet said gun fires. The organized chaos that was RWBY's choreography also kept the scene engaging despite the fact that you knew a blow wouldn't be lethal or even that big of a deal until a character's aura was gone. Fight scenes now are more grounded in their choreography and tend to feel like more traditional exchanges rather than something that could be called bombastic. Now, there are fights that are fairly enjoyable. Tyrion, a member of Salem's faction versus Crow, RWBY's uncle, is a nice fight with multiple remarkable parts. Neo vs Cinder was also a good one. Raven vs Cinder feels like a Dragon Ball fight that takes place in the RWBY universe, and that is absolutely praise. But what makes these fights the exception rather than the standard is how poorly paced a lot of the other fights are. Another one of the strong qualities with early RWBY's fight scenes were how contained they were within their relevant scene, so whatever intensity that was produced only increased as the fight continued. This changed in the Haven arc, and it was definitely for the worse. The most egregious example is how the end of Volume 5 is 15 minutes of a bunch of very separate fights that didn't interact with each other mixed together in a big flat room. But there are more examples of this, like the Blake and Yang vs Adam fight that could have been really cool and emotionally driving, being split across 2 episodes and interspersed with a giant robot fight. And while these are the worst examples and also more of an exception than a rule, it shows the shift in RWBY's approach. My final thoughts on this section is I don't think it's the worst thing in the world to want your long-running series to have a narrative focus, but you can't sacrifice what people know the show for in that pursuit. At this point, all in all, RWBY is still RWBY, and it's still recognizable as RWBY. The experimental direction does maintain some of the high-energy snap-of-the-finger structure that the show used to have. The reception for this change, however, can be best felt in the spin-offs. There are a decent amount of RWBY spin-offs of varying quality. That's main goal is to just expand the brand of the series into different mediums. A lot of spin-offs feel less like attempts at broadening the world and more like, guys, RWBY has a manga! Not inherently a bad thing, but there is one quality that most of these spin-offs have in common, and that's just how many of them are based around the Beacon arc. With 2 video games, a crossover with the third, 3 different manga, 3 comic book runs, 2 movies, 3 novels, and an anime, there are 17 separate pieces of RWBY side content. To give the Haven arc and the next arc, the Atlas arc, the fair shake, if we take out the side material that came out during the first arc of RWBY, that's still a whopping 58% that either take place in that time frame or draw most of the references from it. And most of the Haven or Atlas spin-offs are the comics and novels with the exception of the game Arrowfell, and I guess the second Justice League movie. But it does make sense that if you're trying to broaden RWBY's reach, you should sell people on what they can see in the first episode. That said, there is an issue when the best part to get people's attention is a time of RWBY that has already passed.
One day, after seeing the change in the mood of the village people, the girl decided to wear the hood again. It hardly fit, but if the hood had at least a sprinkle of its former magic, then maybe she would receive the attention she once did. However, what was once a beautiful, vibrant red was now a dull, drab, greyish colour. Much to the girl's dismay, in a way, she was right. The people gave even more unpleasant looks in passing or made comments about how ill-fitting and drab the hood now was, how she had lost her shine. And this was the last straw for the girl's faith in the hood. She wished nothing but ill will on what was lost to her as she dropped the hood in a fire and watched it burn away.
If the Haven arc was when RWBY's popularity started to see a decline, then the Atlas arc is when that popularity got steep. Whether it be how the series has changed even more from its heyday in Volume 3, or maybe it's because of a new host of problems that cropped up in the new arc. That said, I want to be positive first. The series has never looked professionally better. The lighting and atmosphere are damn impressive. The new outfit designs for Atlas are charming. I am in fact excluding Lysa's design, which I have not a small amount of hatred for. There is no justification for the amount of volume in her hair. The fighting's also pleasant. While it's not classic RWBY, the pacing is fine and there are some really cool examples like Ironwood, who's the Atlas headmaster, against one of the villain faction members. Dialogue is also charming, and there are some comedic line deliveries that I like.
Penny just figure that out before you did?
Like, she knew you were a faunus before I did.
I open with these aspects because between Volume 7 and 8, these are the only aspects that I enjoyed. Because if Beacon was based off of free-flowing creativity and Haven was experimentation, then Atlas is based on being the most artificial version of RWBY, being hardly more than an automaton of what it once was, failing at nearly every aspect of what has worked before. Yeah, I don't like this arc. Plot catch-up. Team RWBY made it to the floating kingdom of Atlas to meet with Ironwood and to try to think of some plans to face Salem, while also not trusting Atlas with all the information they have. That setup alone is reasonably strong, and this arc would have stayed strong with that plot if it wasn't hell-bent on being the most lukewarm RWBY has ever been, including plotlines, but not limited, to its bizarre focus of the two relationships to the point where it feels like characters' personalities were rewritten so it's all they ever thought about, reviving a fan-favorite character cause people like Penny, an election plotline, and just being so miserable after a certain point where the world's logic breaks just to make sure things go wrong more often. And to clear things up on the first point, I am of no stance on any ships this series. This isn't about how I thought Ren should have been with Captain Crunch instead of Nora, but as a viewer of the series, it's weird seeing how much these characters have been written to almost just be a catalyst for their ships, having a lot of their dialogue being about the other person in their pairing. That could be because, specifically in Blake and Yang's case, their arcs for the most part are done. Blake's being focused on the White Fang, which has gotten a lot quieter, and Yang on finding her mom, which she did. That's not to say these ships came out of nowhere, but there's such a weird direct spotlight on them. Congratulations to everyone rooting for these pairings though, they weren't the problem, just how I thought they were approached. The latter issue is the worst problem because of how miserable the plot feels at this point, as no matter what, something has to go wrong with whatever the cast is doing. If they have a plan, something has to not work. If they're in a fight, someone has to lose. If a character has some form of choice, they make the wrong one. RWBY no longer feels like a series that is trying to remind you fairy tales aren't real and bad guys can win, and now feels like a fairy tale for the villains! The biggest example of just awful choices in an effort to make everything worse, Crow befriended one of the Ace Ops, one of the new factions in the Atlas arc. While I most certainly have my issues with them, including the fact that this guy Clover uses an actual fucking fishing rod as his weapon, and wasn't this a show of glow stick nunchucks? What happened to— It was a good dynamic, but the cast decided to go against Ironwood, which places them all under arrest. This happens after he catches Tyrion, and not only do they ignore him in order to have a fight, but Crow teams up with the villain to fight his friend. Naturally, it goes wrong in the worst way, because it's never a good idea to team up with someone with an actual evil laugh. And while I can forgive a really weird choice, world building being ignored isn't as easily forgivable. There's an episode where Salem's faction infiltrates the previously mentioned election party thing. Long story. Their plan was to turn off the lights and massacre a lot of people in order to make it look like Penny did it. Things to note. It's been stated that faunus have good night vision.
Many faunus are known to have nearly perfect sight in the dark.
This happens in Volume 1, but gets brought up again in Volume 7.
I think one of you could fit through. Ideally someone with a knack for seeing in the dark.
There is a faunus there. This plan works without a hitch. I put so much focus on these specific moments because it perfectly illustrates how the world has changed just to make sure things go wrong more often, and it's at its worst in Volume 8. Our characters who used to be able to clear hordes of Grimm now can hardly handle one or two. And qualities that used to make the show cool are now treated like obstacles to make the situation worse. Characters get the aura knocked out of them after just one or two hits. Yeah, it's probably because enemies are stronger now, but this is what they could do in Volume 2. This is them now, after apparently being good enough to be official huntsmen. It feels like the cast got nerfed in a super cool fighty show. To be entirely honest, there's more that I like about this arc that I would like to mention. Like how they are trying to put more focus on characters like Ren or Nora. We are seeing them as more than support or jokes. Nora personally gets multiple moments of reflection, and Ren continuously feels the pressure of just how hopeless the situation is. I do also enjoy how far the story is willing to push and crumble its world. By the time Volume 9 comes around, it's borderline apocalypse media, and while this despair isn't well executed, It doesn't feel right or fair to point at 2 seasons of a show and just simply say everything about it is bad, especially if it has traits that I liked earlier. I can appreciate the outcome, but the execution was flawed. I can understand the long-term plan was for this to be the lowest point where everything goes wrong before an upswing when characters start winning. However, what that resulted in was 4 hours and 26 minutes of misery. As characters argue, split up, seemingly give up, or be like Ironwood, who has somehow gone so deep in the sauce of do the right thing no matter the cost, that he has ended up with blow up a bomb in a poor section of Atlas so the main cast will listen as an idea. If the lesson here was people who have always been in charge are too quick to make sacrifices, that would be fine, and it would feed into the hey, kids are the ones doing things right vibe that the early seasons had. But it's a combination of so many things going wrong in a way that's almost difficult to buy that had this show feel so miserable. There was never an issue with the series getting heavier or changing or anything else. A show does need to shift aspects in order to stay around, and a show that's been around for 9 seasons is gonna look kinda different. But the Atlas arc feels like it truly betrayed what made RWBY RWBY. It felt predictable in a way that I would never say Beacon or Haven was predictable, cause you knew whatever bad thing could happen, well, oh no, it happened, a safe narrative choice with no fun added at all. To a degree that it just doesn't fit the show. Combine that with a severely overinflated cast that caused fan favorites to just be around to explain plot beats, this arc is just so rough to get through. There are so many more examples, so many more ramblings I can give to explain why this show feels so ridiculously artificial or so comedically miserable. But if nothing else, let how little I have to say about this part of the show show how much I dislike it and how much it doesn't feel like RWBY. If I wasn't specifically trying to see how I felt about the series on the other side after watching it all, who knows? I may have genuinely dropped it at this point and called RWBY a series that I used to like but not anymore. That I agreed with a lot of the common consensus about the series. But then Volume 9 happened. Team RWBY, Jean, and Neo fell into a void that was believed to be certain death. Rather than dying, they ended up in the Ever After, a Wonderland-inspired world completely separate from the world of Remnant we've been in so far. This is how Volume 9 begins, and there's actually just one simple goal. Get the hell out of the Ever After! While Volume 9 is the shortest, has the least amount of fights, characters, and well, general RWBYisms, it might just be my favorite volume in the series. The Ever After is the perfect location to get away from all the narrative trappings and structure issues that we've built up so far. There are no Grims, so characters can be outwardly emotional without worrying about attracting monsters. Only characters that are relevant to the arc are the ones that fall into the Ever After, so no one feels like they're around exclusively to explain a situation. And even without all the RWBYisms, the Ever After still feels very RWBY, as it does make sense that a world inspired by fairy tales would have a world of fairy tales kicking around. And with it being completely separate from Remnant, there's no chance of failing to replicate RWBY's aesthetical standard here because they aren't trying to. Instead of trying to make a cool gun weapon person again, there's a raccoon that sells stuff for abstract prices. Paper creatures called paper pleasers that's entire thing is trying to be helpful even to their dismay, and even death is different in the Ever After because you actually just respawn into a better version of yourself, which was used so beautifully for RWBY's arc. We'll get to that in a second though. It's such a rapid-fire creativity that's not limited to trying to stay in a line that's been out of sight for years, and it's honestly incredible. And it's no coincidence that the Ever After is built on fixing RWBY's previous issues. Just look at the curious cat that's part mysterious entity and part audience reaction to the series as proof.
Of course not! Exposition is terribly boring. Even this conversation was, on the whole, rather tedious.
I love him. Like mentioned before, Volume 9 is the shortest volume since 3. While that's from the not-so-glamorous side of the season struggling to get greenlit, the runtime ends up being to the story's benefit with how quick the pacing is. Melting together serious, comedic, beautiful, and soul-crushing moments all in compact and meaningful episodes. The pacing combined with such an increased quality in writing serves as such a palate cleanser from the drawn-out suffer marathon that were the past 2 volumes. To fully express what Volume 9 does right, a general plot catch-up. Everything went wrong. Like, super duper wrong even. Villains have 2 of the relics, which is really bad. Atlas has fallen, not in like the figurative way, more like the I shit you not way. Penny is the first character to die twice, this time of guilt to Jean. This is all bad, like really bad. And it is used masterfully to break down Ruby, Rose, and Jean arc in order to build them back up again. While everyone had their arcs of self-doubt and breakdown, the two team leaders haven't been able to, and now that they have the chance, it's a level of character writing that RWBY hasn't had before, and it's fantastic. There's a scene where RWBY and John snap at each other and everyone else, and before that, so much is laid out for it to make sense. Like how often RWBY tries to talk about how she feels from everything that's been lost, but she keeps being cut off and ignored. John with the fact that he got sent decades into the past and has been alone, but rather than talk about the scene in detail, it's better to explain why this scene is done so well. In Volume 2, there was a scene where each member of Team RWBY was questioned on why they wanted to become a huntress. Vice, Blake, and Yang gave supposedly weak answers, but RWBY wasn't even questioned. Her resolve did not need to be tested. When Volume 2 was written, that was probably the intention, but RWBY's arc in the Ever After feels like the answer as she goes through a trial that literally beats the very resolve out of her. And she ultimately chooses to, like when most things in the Ever After are done with their purpose, chooses to try to become something else. The emotional impact that RWBY has wanted for the past 3 volumes is executed perfectly here. Just take 2 characters who have been pushed right before their breaking point and give them time to reflect on the 2 seasons of absolute tragedy. It's just so good! And so is the combat! It's not classic RWBY fighting, but it's so good! I want more of this! Choreography is snappy and stylized, like when gun recoil was used tactically for the first time since Beacon. And it's accompanied with immaculate music. Hell, the only issue of Volume 9 is there isn't enough of it. But that's just how good the narrative is. It makes me want more for the first time since Volume 6. It sets out what it wants to do and knocks it out of the park. And the tone is able to be heavy and light so characters can show pleasant personality while the stakes are still so grim that was a pun. Vice, for instance, is hilarious in this volume, but she doesn't feel out of place with RWBY, who quite literally tries to YouTube age-restricted word herself because of the masterful balance that is still able to hold value in the heavier scenes. From action set pieces to character arcs like Jean's resolve or RWBY's trial of being pushed to the brink by Neo, only to end up picking to stay herself, and the intro chords to Red Like Roses, the first song in the Red trailer, plays, and then it goes into Guide My Way, which might be the best RWBY song, and I genuinely cried while watching this. But is it enough? Is it enough to mean RWBY has its identity back from the stretches of attempts to make everything sad, rejection of what made the series what it was, and was it enough for me to say that I do like this series because 7 and 8 took it out of me? Volume 9 is fantastic, I love it. But is it good enough to fix what those volumes did to the series? Looking back, Volumes 4 and 6 were charming, but were they even RWBY? These were my thoughts around the time I finished Volume 9, and as I was considering this, a friend sent me a link to the 10th anniversary hoodie for sale. A hoodie with an uncolored rose graphic on the sleeve, an original logo on the chest, and a large illustration of Ruby Rose with her hood on the back. It's really, really cool in all honesty, and it's what finally made me start thinking about my final thoughts on the series. Would I buy merchandise from a series that I don't even like? A show that changed what it was to either attempt to rebrand or to make it last longer? That left behind what people valued from the series? An albeit dramatic approach, but this was a thought process that I had. Do I like RWBY? I do. I do still like RWBY. It is a very, very flawed series that at first didn't know how to keep a serious tone and then went into a phase of experimentation where it tried whatever it could think of, and then it's like the series panicked, tried to go back, and then proceeded to burn itself to the ground. But RWBY is unlike any piece of media that I've ever gotten the pleasure to experience before, and that is not only enough to fuel probably one of the most passionate and talented fan bases I've ever seen, but it's also enough for me to say that I still like it. That I get to keep a show that I loved when I was 15 years old. Did RWBY lose its identity? Yeah, in a way. And there are times I mean that really harshly. And there are times where I mean that really positively, as in it evolved. Because RWBY couldn't have stayed the same rule of cool fun show that it originally was, and it very easily could have gotten stuck like that. But yeah, I enjoy RWBY, and I'm not going to hesitate to say that. And naturally, I do want Volume 10 to get greenlit, despite everything. Because even flawed stories, even flawed fairy tales, deserve a happy ending, don't they?
The regret surfaced faster than the smoke faded, the ashes of the hood the only sign left of his existence. Oh, how the girl agonized. The magical hood did nothing wrong, and now it was gone. The hood that was with her through everything was destroyed just because she didn't get the adoration she so desperately sought. But while she did feel guilty, there was also a sense of relief in her chest. With the hood being gone, the pressure of being seen and accepted by others also went away, and with that came a newfound love for her own shine. Ready to be herself again, the girl stepped out with a beautiful new hairband. It may have been a tad tacky, maybe the village people hated it, but she liked it quite a bit. And as she walked by, my, what a beautiful, vibrant red colour it glowed.
If you've made it to the end, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed the video as much as I enjoyed making it. And this would not have been possible if it wasn't for the multiple people who helped. From Viddy's Vids providing the artwork for the fairy tale segments, or Super Eyepatch Wolf providing his voice. That's still really cool. And I won't forget the countless friends who listened to me talk about RWBY since December and helped me revise different aspects of the video and just were there to support me through this project. I don't think I could have finished it without every single person who even somewhat touched this video, and I don't think I would have wanted to. But if you liked it, hey, maybe subscribe? I promise I upload a lot more often, and also, if you want more of me, I stream every Thursday on Twitch that I'm available. It's a lot of fun. We play some fun anime games. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you everyone who helped. And I'll see you all again really soon.